The title of this presentation is Owning the Shadow. The shadow is an essential aspect of our unconscious world, but it's impossible to describe or capture the totality of the unconscious in words. It has too many different aspects and functions, too many levels and interconnections. It's always in motion, changing and fluid, like a vast ocean that stretches far beyond the eye can see. We can know a little more about our own personal shadow, the dark mirror image of our ego. It holds those facets of our personal self that are hard to bear, difficult to face, and are pushed out of awareness. Like a dark, cluttered closet, the shadow is crammed with discarded parts of ourself, some broken, most unwanted. But hidden amongst these darker aspects are valuable inner resources and boundless energy. Only as we reclaim and own our shadow can these treasures, what Robert Johnson calls the gold in the shadow, be fully integrated into our being. To begin the process of integration, of individuation, we first have to turn and face our darkness. The shadow is a concept that Jung introduced, although it actually refers to something which human beings have known forever, the dark side. These are two very powerful quotations from Jung. The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realms of our animal ancestors. So the personal shadow rests on a whole basis of instinct and ancestral forces, going back really to the beginnings of time. Some of the aspects of the shadow are very instinctual and very difficult for us to deal with. This is another quote. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself or herself and represents a tight passage, a narrow door whose painful constriction no one is spared, who goes down to the deep well. To know ourselves, we have to explore the underworld of our psyche. We have to pass through this narrow door of self-awareness to find the water of life, this energy which is actually in the shadow often and holds us back physically and psychologically. So what is the personal shadow? Very simply, the shadow is the person we do not wish to be. It's very similar to Freud's unconscious. It's a repository of all that's lost, neglected, and unavowed. It contains our avoided desires, our impulses and fantasies, the ones that we don't really want to own. Some of the things which come up in our dreams when we're unguarded, when our defenses are low. It also contains a lot of positive qualities that are lost or denied. So for instance, if you repress something, often with it goes something that's positive. So you lose that. For instance, if you repress anger, you can lose energy because the anger also contains energy. It contains those rejected parts of our personality and the forgotten, hidden, and repressed experiences, which I'll talk about a little later, which we can't really face. So it can have amazingly positive as well as negative qualities, and it carries this life energy in it. This life energy, this physical and psychic energy, which is our true inheritance. So what shapes the personal shadow? What does it comprise? Well, most obviously, any trauma and deprivation. I'm going to go over these aspects in detail in later slides. So trauma and deprivation, fears of abandonment and rejection, what I call life-defining or life-binding decisions, and unrealistic expectations of ourself, and finally, personal complexes. All of these also affect and shape the ego, because the ego and the personal shadow are mirror images of themselves. So let's look at trauma and deprivation. Trauma is an experience that overwhelms our natural healing capacity. It causes our body and psyche to compensate by creating a scar that conceals the deep damage beneath. So let me look at some traumatic life events. It can be difficult birth, it can be accidents, illnesses, and losses. These all can be overwhelming to the psyche so that it can't face them. It can't integrate them or digest them. Of course, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse is the kind of trauma which is very common, really damages somebody, often for life. Physical, mental, and emotional deprivation. Deprivation is as common and as damaging as trauma, and it's more insidious and subtle in its effects. So a person can easily be emotionally deprived without actually realizing it. They can be mentally deprived in the sense that they are born into an environment which does not stimulate them to grow, to understand, to think. So let me talk about my own trauma. So when I was age 2, I was on a haystack in a farm where we lived, and I slipped and fell, and I broke my leg. It was broken quite badly, the top of the leg and the femur. And so I had to go into hospital and had to have the leg in traction. In those days, in the 50s, they didn't allow visitors. Certainly, they didn't allow your parents to come in more than once a week, and they didn't allow your siblings to be there. I had 5 siblings who I was close to. And I remember looking at them through the window in my ward and them waving to me and smiling at me and feeling devastatedly lonely. You could say that trauma caused me to turn inwards and set the scene for many other things which happened to me later in life. So let's look at fears of abandonment and rejection. Well, the fear of abandonment is our most primal fear as it's directly connected to survival. For a baby, to be abandoned is to die. That's often hard for us to understand cognitively because we've forgotten this feeling. But we know that if a baby is left alone for more than a certain amount of time, it's going to die. And the baby knows that. And this primal fear of being abandoned gets connected to all sorts of other experiences as we grow up. It becomes, if you like, a defining fear and often is a very physiological experience. Because as we grow up, it's not just abandonment, physically abandonment, but it's the sense of being outcast or unwanted by our family or odd, that we don't fit. It stops us being able to develop a fully coherent and solid sense of self. So to be outcast by our family is to have no self. To be unaccepted by your peer group as you grow up and are in school is to die socially. And a lot of bullying and rejection in school causes deep scars in the psyche. So these are all sorts of rejecting experiences which are basically built on the fear of abandonment, the feeling of being unwelcome or unwanted in the world. And then, of course, to be shunned by a social group, even when we're grown up, is to become a non-person. So going back to the hospital stay, plus the fact that my mother did not really enjoy children, it was a defining aspect of my childhood and of my psyche. So on the fear of abandonment and rejection, and because of those, we start to make what I call life-defining decisions. It forces us to make these unconscious and semi-conscious decisions about how to be in order to be accepted and to live in the world, to be a part and to be welcome. These early decisions are powerful enough to define how we will be for the rest of our life. So these are decisions about how we have to be. The sense that if I am not like this, I am not acceptable. Some of the decisions are about how not to make the same mistakes as our parents, because we don't want to be like them. So that actually is probably a good decision. I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm not going to make those same mistakes. However, that can kind of lock us into a certain way of being. One of the common decisions that people made, and I actually made it when I was younger, was never to get married, because I could see from my parents how painful and damaging marriage was, and I didn't know any other alternative. So that was a decision which I had to change. We also make decisions about who we have to become. Sometimes there's unlived lives of our parents, and our parents want us to be a certain way. And we take these in, we introject them, and believe that we have to live those lives. I'm thinking of my brother, for instance, who went to university and studied law. It was totally inappropriate for his interests or his being. But my mother had a father who was a lawyer, and she wanted one of her children to become a lawyer. So, talking about life defining decisions, I'll tell you a story about at the age of 10, my brother used to bully me, and I lost my temper. I picked up a knife and I went after him with the intention of stabbing him. So I chased him, and I chased him for a long time with this knife. I was so angry, I was so outraged. What happened when I cooled down was I realized that I could have killed him and that I could never have made that better. It would have been an event which could have never been repaired. So I made the decision not to be angry ever again. And that decision was strong enough that it wasn't until my late adolescence, when I was 18 or 19, that I actually started to experience anger. And I was living on a farm at the time. And I started to find myself being unconsciously and compulsively abusive to the animals on this farm. And it shocked me totally. That was the shadow coming out from a decision that I'd made maybe 10 years earlier. So let me talk about unrealistic self-expectation. Our ego has to adapt to the world, but it manipulates itself. It shifts itself so that it's no longer true to its nature. And in that sense, we cover up our true nature and our relationship with our true self. So expectations and judgments from our ego about what kind of person we should or have to be accepted, these become built into our ego. They become self-expectations. They become who we think we are. There's also expectations, as I said, from our parents about how we have to be in the family. And these expectations are often unconscious. And as I said about the unlived life of the parents, we're taught at home and in school what it means to be a good person, how to avoid getting into trouble. It's only when we get into adolescence that we start to rebel against those expectations. But even so, they're very powerful and they capture us. And then there's the general expectation from the society and the culture about what we should believe, how we should behave, what it means to be a person. Now, the last thing when I'm talking about the personal shadow is our personal complexes. Complexes are complicated. They have a very powerful psychic charge, and they capture us, and they take over our ego for a period of time. Then we can feel guilty, or we can feel bad about what we've done, or we can simply forget that they ever happened. So complex has this kind of ability, it's semi-autonomous. It's got a life of its own, and it jumps the ego, captures it. Angry outbursts, crying without knowing why. These are aspects, or these are symptoms of the complex. And often when we've been captured by a complex, we make excuses and justifications because that's the aspect of self-deception when I talked about the ego. So these are parts of the psyche that take over our consciousness and behavior. Complexes form usually around a core of shame, guilt, trauma, fear, those kind of things. They're like crystallized aspects of ourselves built around these central issues or experiences. So when I was 15, I realized that I had this core of shame around my mother. She didn't live with us. She had basically abandoned the family, and I lived with my father. And this was in the 60s, where to have just a father was very unusual. And I felt completely taken over by this shame, very self conscious. And I decided I needed to do something about this. I decided I'd tell a friend of mine about this, but I wouldn't just tell him directly. I'd drop it into the conversation when he wasn't really noticing. I did that. And of course, he didn't notice. He didn't take it as something big. He didn't say, oh, that means you're such a terrible person. And that dissipated that shame. It dissipated that complex somewhat. So that's what a complex is like. You can think of it as kind of crystalline. In the center is whatever the shame or the guilt or the trauma. And then around it, we build layers and layers of protection until it has this charge. And part of that charge is archetypal. What that means is that it's more than personal. So a complex can be a mother complex. That means it takes on some of the archetypal energy of the mother archetype or the father archetype or the masculine or the feminine. And complexes are triggered by particular events or experiences. So we know that people who've been traumatized, anything that's similar to the trauma will trigger that complex and that person will be taken over. So, for instance, if somebody has been physically abused and they're with a partner who raises their voice, they will often go into shock. They will freeze as though they're about to be beaten. This is the complex. Depressions, self-doubt, can be triggered by a small mistake because of the criticism that a person experienced earlier in their life. We've explored the causes of the shadow, the ways in which the shadow is formed, how it grows, particularly in our childhood and throughout our life, from those things we cannot face. Now we need to look at how we feed it, how we maintain it, how we make it grow stronger so that it spreads its darkness. We know that to help integrate the shadow, we need to develop self-awareness. The opposite of self-awareness is avoidance. That is when we actively or passively push troubling thoughts, feelings, and experiences out of our mind. We know that we have a particular issue, but we refuse to face it. We let it just slip away. We forget or procrastinate about dealing with it. So we don't face our fears, our restrictions, our complexes, and we don't own the behaviors, the dysfunctional behaviors. Hand in hand with avoidance goes denial. Denial is a little bit more sophisticated in that we kind of know that it's going on, but we minimize its impact or importance. We don't look at how that really affects our attitudes or actions. So a good example is alcoholism, where a person will say, well, I only just drink a little bit. Or smoking, oh, well, it's not going to do me any harm. And so that's a way in which we justify in our own mind through rationalizations, or as we're going to look at next, through projection. Projection is when we blame, condemn, and project onto others those things we do not want to face in our own shadow. So what is projection? Projection is both a curse and a blessing. There are some positive aspects of projection. It's the cause of most of human suffering. It's the cause of war, exploitation, abuse, evil. It's also the path to deeper self-awareness and compassion, if we can catch it, if we can notice our projections. We can only harm another being if they are not like us. If we push onto them those shadow aspects of ourselves and make them inhuman. So this is the cause of racism. It's the cause of seeing people as the enemy. War particularly requires projection of the collective shadow so that we can murder innocent or misguided people. When we project or projected onto, we distort reality according to whatever is unintegrated in our shadow. So projection causes us to blame, to prejudge, and hold unrealistic expectations of others, ones which don't fit their behavior or their true nature. We see just little parts of who they are, and then we can project the dark energy. And when we project, it's a powerful energetic force that we project onto others. It captures them. and it can tangle people's egos so that they feel it physically. So we also have the same experience when we're projected onto. So we know that we must be doing this to others. It's a dark energy. It pulls a person into their own shadow, and they respond from that shadow aspect in themselves. Now, the projections are mostly negative. We tend to project negative energy because that's what we can't face. But some of our projections are overly positive. Falling in love is actually, in some sense, a very positive form of projection. We see only goodness in the person we love. But there can be a dark side to also positive projections where we're worshipping somebody unrealistically. We're not seeing their true nature, as in a guru worship. We don't see that they actually may be doing things which are harmful. Now, for a projection to stick, there must be a hook. It means that there's something in that other person where when we throw the net of our projection onto them, something sticks. There's a little hook that they have which captures the projection. Because everybody has their own shadow, so everybody is vulnerable to holding other people's projections. But blatantly unreal and untrue projections have a really hard time sticking. For our own self, if we're not taken by the projection, if we do not get caught by it, we do not get stuck in it, it tends to fall away. So these are some quotes from Jung about the shadow, about working with the shadow. If we spend some time thinking about them and looking into what they mean, it can be very helpful. So Jung says the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. This is what all religion is about. This is what self-growth is about, what conscious evolution. Through working with the shadow, we do change ourselves and we do change those around us, and therefore we change the world. And moral effort means acknowledging our unconsciousness, acknowledging our avoidance and denial, and aspiring to be a better person. So this is another quote. If and when an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, he becomes aware of, and often ashamed of, those qualities and impulses he denies in himself, but can plainly see in others, such as egotism, mental laziness and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice. This is seeing ourselves as we really are, both light and shadow, and not projecting the negative aspects of ourselves, or even the positive, onto others. What do we need to do to own the shadow? First of all, I have to face my flaws and faults and do something about them. It's no good turning away. I have to face them. I have to see them, acknowledge them. That's the whole basis of self-awareness. I need to take responsibility for my complexes, for my reactions, for the things which harm other people. I need to see my weaknesses and see how I get trapped and triggered. I have to accept and forgive myself for what I don't like about myself. My feelings, my desires, my fantasies, my impulses, my body, the way my mind works. I have to accept those. This is what I've been given. I know that whenever I judge others, I can be almost certain that that's projection of my shadow. Judgment, as we've seen, is a shadow aspect of the ego. And when I'm judging others, I'm projecting that shadow. This is an interesting one. I resist being perfect or too good. Why is that? Because perfection, or trying to be good, tends to constellate and give energy to the opposite, to the negative, to the badness, to the imperfection. It's only when we look at ourselves in a realistic way can we say, this is who I am. And then lastly, I accept my uniqueness and peculiarities. I am who I am, and I have to accept that. I also accept some of the weaknesses, the flaws, the issues, which I know are going to be with me for the whole of my life. And they then become a management issue. This is a final quote from Jung. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole.